Welcome to the best horror movie you never saw, where we shine a light on horror movies that you may have missed, haven't seen in a long time, or just plain forgot about. In this episode, we're diving into 1987's Stepfather as it explores one of the most terrifying notions of them all: having your parent get remarried.
Here's Johnny!
All kidding aside, the movie is thrilling in all of its simplicity, and the fact that the threat is within the home adds a sense of realism that was missing from most horror films released in the 80s. Led by a perfectly chilling performance from Terry O'Quinn, he's provided stellar support from Jill Sholin and Shelley Hack as the actor's seemingly calm exterior begins to gradually melt away to show how truly unhinged he actually is. If anyone has had the experience of having a step-parent, you would be forgiven if this movie made you give them the side eye when they first enter your life. The Stepfather received very positive reviews upon release and has since gone on to become a cult classic, but it appears that difficulty in how to promote the release could have been what led to its muted box office performance when it first hit theaters.
Father knows best.
Why did it take so long for The Stepfather to find an audience? Let's explore that and more as we dive headfirst into one of the best horror movies you never saw. I want to thank you guys for watching the best horror movie you never saw and ask that if you enjoy our shows, please subscribe to our channel right now. Like the video and click on the bell so you can be notified each time a new video goes up. And now, back to the show. The fact that The Stepfather's best attribute is its eerie realism might have a lot to do with the inspiration behind the film. The story is loosely based on John List, and it's a tale that is far more frightening than any horror movie you could really see. On November 9th, 1971, List killed his wife, mother, and 3 children at their home in Westfield, New Jersey. The murders were planned with such care that when he disappeared, nearly a month had passed before anyone suspected the crime had occurred. The now masked murderer would go on to assume a new identity, get remarried, and eluded capture for nearly 18 years. His motive eluded to critical financial problems and the idea that his family was straying away from their religious faith. List believed that by murdering them, it would guarantee their souls a place in heaven. It's a twisted story, but aspects of it did shape the DNA of what eventually would become the film. Carolyn Leftgord, who was working as a story editor for Walt Disney Pictures at the time, showed the article about John List to writer Brian Garfield. Once he saw the story, they brought in novelist Donald E. Westlake to help them shape the film's script. The basics of the story would be about a man who is betrayed by the American dream, and when he doesn't achieve that ideal, he kills and starts over until he does.
Rest in peace, Doctor.
Terry O'Quinn's Henry Morrison is first seen washing off blood in the bathroom after slaughtering the family he'd been living with. We eventually learn that he assumes a different identity to find the perfect family, and when they don't live up to his standards, they're fair game for murder. He lives by the motto of, when at first you don't succeed, dust yourself off and try again. By the time we meet him again 1 year later, he's a real estate agent named Jerry Blake, living a pretty cushy life in the Seattle suburbs. Blake also has a new family to call his own, as he's married widow Susan Main, played by Shelley Hack, and becomes the stepfather to her daughter Stephanie, played by Jill Sholin.
Yay.
As some kids are when their parents decide to remarry, Stephanie has a strained relationship with Jerry, and that's confided to her psychiatrist, Dr. Bondurant. She's advised to give him a chance, but as most horror films have taught on a frequent basis, you should always trust the misgivings of kids. They see things that most adults don't. By the very nature of Horror Movie 101, they're just always smarter and shouldn't be pushed aside for overacting. Making things a bit more difficult is that Stephanie has behavioral issues at school. Her strained relationship with Jerry could be viewed as teenage rebellion.
Listen, sweetheart, it seems like you and I are butting heads all the time.
It's not long, however, before his past begins to catch up with him and his pleasant facade begins to crack. Even as he tries to eliminate the obstacles getting in the way of his happy home, Jerry begins to realize that this family just won't do either, and it's time to move on to the next one. Director Joseph Rubin got to really flex his thriller muscles on this particular project. He first found out about the film after reading an early draft of the script, and he immediately was drawn to it because of just how deliciously good the bad guy was. While the things that he's doing are fundamentally evil, Rubin thought that what made him interesting was that he wanted what we all want: a beautiful home, a beautiful family. His fantasy doesn't match reality, and he goes that extra mile when that fantasy isn't achieved. As a serial killer, there is more depth on display, and that's something Rubin was interested in exploring.
This is as good as it gets.
To bring this character to life, they needed to find the right actor, but it proved to be a difficult task. Most actors that read the script didn't want to play this guy because he was that rotten to the core. Rubin had said that every name or semi-name they approached all turned them down. Thankfully, the stars aligned to find Terry O'Quinn because no one was suited to play this role other than him. He gives a performance that's all about nuance. You have to buy that he's pleasant and charming enough to fool Susan into marrying him, and then you have to believe the crazy that's boiling underneath the surface. This is someone who's a real estate agent. He needs a megawatt smile to make a sale. O'Quinn definitely has a natural likability that allows you to accept he could weasel his way into not only a family, but a whole community as well. I know he's had several other roles across his career that he's known for, particularly playing John Locke on the series Lost, but there is a strong argument to be made that this is his signature performance. Discussing the actor's choices further, even though O'Quinn was a relative unknown at the time, the director was always impressed with his choices. While doing the scene in the basement when he has to shift personas and completely lose it, he saw firsthand just how good he was. Jill Sholin discovers him in the basement as he truly shows some of the violence within him. He doesn't know that his stepdaughter is watching him, but when he hears her, he suddenly snaps out of it. Then he goes back to the facade he's been portraying as a nice guy and says,
Hi, honey.
Rubin recalled shooting that scene and said it was that particular scene when he realized he had a great actor having a truly fantastic moment. As you go through the movie, you'll notice that he has several moments like this, and during the now classic line reading of "Who am I here?" you can legitimately see his wires getting crossed and almost shutting down like a robot.
Wait a minute. Who am I here?
A performance like that takes a great deal of talent to get right, and you can tell he was up to the task. Filming on The Stepfather took place in Vancouver, Canada, beginning on October 15th, 1986, and the shoot was said to be pretty smooth by director Joseph Rubin. All of the performers were great, but he does admit there was a sense that they didn't know if they were making a good movie. They believe that they're certainly making something interesting and that it was different from the typical thrillers that were out there during the time, that they were dealing with some themes that may have not worked in lesser hands.
Hey, I thought this was supposed to be a party.
It's important to make everything appear as if nothing bad could happen in this town, so there is a sense of safety in the cookie-cutter appearance of the community and everyone living in it. It's the perfect image of the suburbs that is hiding pure evil within it. This adds a lot to the film's tension and unease. For instance, Jerry has repeatedly refused to meet Stephanie's psychiatrist, which makes Dr. Bondurant make an appointment with him in the guise of wanting to buy a house. The psychiatrist begins to ask too many questions, and Jerry assumes he's an undercover cop and proceeds to beat him to death. The scene is a nice slow build, and as an audience, we've been slightly fooled by Jerry's Norman Rockwell persona. This makes the sudden rage all the more shocking and proves that the movie's biggest strength, other than Terry O'Quinn, is keeping the audience off balance. Proving to be important to the project in her own right is Jill Sholin. Stephanie really is the voice of the audience. She knows something isn't right about her stepfather, and even though she's troubled, you still root for her to make others not so blind to what he's all about. It's also believable that her mind changes about him on the occasions he covers up his misdeeds. Stephanie is proactive in writing a letter to the newspaper when she reads the article about Jerry's earlier murders, believing her stepfather to be the man behind it all. She requests a photo of the person in question, but the letter is intercepted by Jerry. Once he places a stranger's photo in the letter, Stephanie begins to question her own suspicions. In another twisted case of bonding with his stepdaughter, having murdered her psychiatrist he claims was killed in a car accident, and actually accomplishes gaining a bit of affection from her.
was a very special man.
It only quickly falls apart when Jerry goes grade A psycho after seeing his stepdaughter kissing her boyfriend Paul, who he accuses of trying to rape her. It's this argument that makes him determined to begin a new identity, because this is not the family he once hoped for. If not for the well-written and performed push and pull between these two characters, I don't think it would work as well as it does. New Century Vista Film Corporation secured distribution rights to the film in the fall of 1986. This was a new company started by Norman Levy, who was the former chair of 20th Century Fox. The Stepfather would be their first acquisition, and they had the daunting task of figuring out how to promote the finished product. Early test screenings were said to be very positive, which was encouraging for New Century. The decision was initially made to market the movie as a psychological thriller, but after opening in 105 theaters on January 23, 1987, the film grossed a mere $260,587. New Century attempted several different marketing campaigns that made the film first appear as an adult psychological thriller, but after 6 weeks of release, the grosses only reached $1.3 million. It was then decided to begin marketing the project as a slasher film to attract a younger audience, but that move didn't seem to work either. Keep in mind, this was 1987 and the slasher movie craze was being ruled by Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and Michael Myers. Younger audiences were used to these heavyweights, so a more cerebral psychological thriller would not be on their radar. As for why old audiences didn't respond, Levy speculated that a lack of major stars or a well-known director contributed to it not being much of interest to them. At its highest theater count, the movie was only in 148 locations, and the decision was made to not go wider because of its initial mediocre performance. By the end of its theatrical run, The Stepfather grossed a mere $2.6 million. It's a shame that The Stepfather couldn't translate solid reviews to a better box office performance, because critics definitely liked what they saw. The Rotten Tomatoes score sits at an impressive 88%, and it was mostly praised as an engrossing suspense thriller. Terry O'Quinn was frequently cited for his amazing performance and his complete commitment to bringing a villain like this to life. The actor was nominated for both a Saturn and an Independent Spirit Award for his performance, while Joseph Rubin was honored with the Critics Award at the 1988 Cognac Festival. For her efforts, Jill Sholin was nominated for a Young Artist Award for her work in the film. Despite the original's muted box office performance, a sequel came to fruition in 1989, The Stepfather 2, also known as Stepfather 2, Make Room for Daddy in some parts, brought back Terry O'Quinn. Unfortunately, just about everything that made the first movie great was omitted. Jeff Burr stepped in as director, replacing Joseph Rubin, and the writing team was also missing in action, with the sequel being penned by John Auerbach. O'Quinn is joined in the film by Meg Foster, Caroline Williams, and Jonathan Brandis, but this endeavor ends up being a giant misfire. The problem with Stepfather 2 is that it follows familiar beats established in its predecessor, but it doesn't do them nearly as well. Terry O'Quinn is still a joy to watch, but you can see the project falling into slasher movie traps rather than being a smart psychological thriller. The sequel has its own interesting backstory in the sense that after a test screening, studio execs Harvey and Bob Weinstein, those guys, complained about the lack of gore and demanded reshoots. Jeff Burr refused to comply, and director Doug Campbell was brought in to do the reshoots. Terry O'Quinn also refused to take part in the reshoots, and Burr has said, quote, "They cut a little bit out and they added some badly done blood effects." Badly done because Terry O'Quinn refused to do it. Really, they were meaningless, so that was irritating. The sequel was originally intended to be a direct-to-video release, but the producers were somehow impressed by what they saw to go theatrical. So after getting a limited release, The Stepfather 2 died a quick death and ultimately grossed $1.5 million at the domestic box office. As for the critics, the film has a big, fat 0% on Rotten Tomatoes for all of its troubles. That reception didn't stop a third entry from getting made. Stepfather 3, also known as Stepfather 3 Father's Day, was released in 1992 as a made-for-TV movie. The biggest fault of the third installment is that it's missing Terry O'Quinn's performance. I'm not 100% sure if he was offered to return, but if he was, he wisely chose to sit this one out. Directed by Guy Megar and film stars Robert Whiteman and Priscilla Barnes, David Tom and Susan Hubley. Reviews were slightly better than that of the second movie, but it still wasn't warmly received in most circles. Entertainment Weekly gave it a D+ and said it was a poorly scripted, all too familiar chiller. They also called Robert Whiteman, who assumed the role of the titular character, robotic and a weak substitute for previous death-dealing dad, Terry O'Quinn. While all of this was going on, the 1987 release gained a lot of traction as a cult classic. There could be a few reasons for this, but when Terry O'Quinn began playing John Locke on Lost in 2004, that series took off like a rocket, and the actor's work in that role was often highly regarded by fans and critics. There was a real curiosity about some of his other work, and I think this helped many more people discover the Stepfather as they explored his filmography. Might not be a direct science, but it's a correlation worth exploring. For better or worse, the film's exposure as a cult classic resulted in The Stepfather getting the remake treatment in 2009. Directed by Nelson McCormick, the remake stars Dylan Walsh, Cella Ward, Penn Bagley, and John Tenney, and Amber Heard. Wonder whatever happened to her.
My dog stepped on a bee. We went to the vet.
Anyway, while this redo of the original is slickly made and has some decent performances, it can't help but be a pale imitation of the movie that inspired it. Dylan Walsh is a fine actor, but he lacked the nuances that made Terry O'Quinn so fun in that role. The film does pull a gender switch by making the daughter of the original now a son. There are some interesting things about the change that actually work. Seeing the son's perspective, as he would naturally be more protective of his mother as she enters into a new relationship, makes the film's flip not all that terrible, but it also strips away some of the vulnerability of having a daughter in that situation. Penn Badgley gives an adequate performance, but the end result finds the remake in the same position as most horror reboots during this time period. It all feels unnecessary, and you just want to shout out to the new generation that chose to see it to give the original their time instead. Released by Sony Screen Gems on October 16, 2009, the film debuted at number 5 in the box office with a gross of $11.6 million. With a budget of $20 million, the film wasn't a total bomb by the time it ended its run with $29.1 million at the domestic box office, but it was clear that it lacked staying power. Reviews were also dismal, registering at 11% on Rotten Tomatoes with a consensus that reads, "This tepid remake of the 1987 cult classic lacks the tension and satirical undercurrents of the original." The upside to the remake being made was that Shout Factory released the original film on DVD just 3 days before the debut of the reboot. A Blu-ray version would follow on June 15th, 2010, and this opened up the movie to be received by a brand new audience. For those who saw the remake and wanted to know if the source material was any better, they now had an easily accessible way to do so. Even though The Stepfather missed its true shot to be a hit upon release, the film still stands up as a world-class thriller that is much smarter than the time period it was released in would suggest. As we were being saturated with the numerous slasher sequels and wannabes, The Stepfather dared to do something different. Thankfully, over time, people have gradually discovered this twisted tale at obtaining the American dream at any cost. For anyone with a recent step-parent out there, look at this for notes on what to look out for so you don't end up with a psychopath living right under your nose.